Welcome, everyone. This is the Google Hangout on Iraq and Syria. What's next? My name is Peter Lenz. I work at the American Friends Service Committee, and for the next hour, we're very fortunate to be having a conversation with three seasoned activists about what's happening in Iraq and Syria. Speaking first will be Raed Jarrar, who is a Policy Impact Coordinator at the American Friends Service Committee. AFSC was founded in 1917 and is a Quaker organization that promotes lasting peace with justice. Our second speaker is going to be Joe Comerford, who is a campaign director for MoveOn.org, an online community of more than 8 million committed activists who use innovative technology to win campaigns for progressive change. And our third speaker will be Stephen Miles. He's the advocacy director for Win Without War, a diverse coalition of more than 40 member organizations that was formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We wanted to take the opportunity today to start and deconstruct what we're hearing and offer you some vision for a path forward around Iraq and Syria. Over the weekend, it was announced that on Wednesday, President Obama is scheduled to address the nation around Iraq, ISIS, and Syria. What we've seen from leaks in the press yesterday, as well as pre-planned strategy, is that it could be a 36-month campaign. It could be a 3-year campaign that seeks to destroy ISIS in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The reason for this call is that we really feel that we are capable of providing much better alternatives. Raed's going to give us an update, an overview of what's happened in the last year. Joe's going to talk about strategy and how political change happens. And Stephen is going to let us know what's happening in Congress. They've been on vacation for the last month and have just returned to DC. Before we get started, I just want to remind ourselves where we've been, particularly our relationship with the country of Iraq, with which we've been at war since 1991. These have been undeclared wars, and they have involved massive ground troops. They've involved secret special forces. They've involved the use of drones. It's involved the use of comprehensive economic and political sanctions. And it's also had the imposition of reparations that the country of Iraq was forced to pay to Kuwait. Following the invasion in 2003, I wanted to kind of highlight 4 of the big structural changes that we as a country were responsible for. One was this idea that we could use military force to remove governments we don't like. The second, and related to the first, was the refusal to adequately deal with the refugee crisis that was created by this violence. The third aspect is something that I think is the U.S. role in degrading sort of international law, and that, as you'll recall, is through the documented use of torture by the United States, particularly at Abu Ghraib, and also the policy of indefinite detention without trial at Guantanamo Bay, and of course the evolution of a drone program that has embraced targeted assassination. So many of us are aware of the military tools that we've employed against the country of Iraq and the region for the last 25 years. The conversation today is really going to be, what do the alternatives look like and what are some strategies? We're also intending to answer your questions. You'll see below this broadcast that there is a chat box, and so I urge you to use to put your questions there, pose your reactions and your comments. We also will be taking questions at questions@afsc.org, and so if you want to send in a question there, it'll get to me and I will ask our presenters. So the last quote I want to leave you with is from a political scientist that I read quite a lot, Rami Houri. I think his synopsis of the impact of the war in 2003 really is kind of the foundation for this conversation. And here's what he said: Iraq, since 2003, represents everything that we want to avoid in the Arab world: foreign invasions, simplistic American political engineering, sharp internal polarization, ethnic cleansing, and warfare. This conversation is the beginning of how we can break that cycle. So again, welcome Raed, Joe, and Stephen. And Raed, you're first.
Thank you, Peter. I think the three of us, the speakers, have decided to limit our time to minimum to give a larger space for questions and answers. I will invest my 5 minutes to discuss a couple of main misperceptions or main points that I would like to examine today. The first one is the landscape in Iraq, and the second one is about the contradiction in the Obama administration's policies in Syria and Iraq. Regarding the landscape in Iraq, the mainstream narrative so far tries to paint a picture of Iraq where there is one bad guy, ISIS, that we need to step in with our good allies and save the day. We have to step in to eliminate that one bad guy, and we have a few good allies in Iraq and the region. Things on the ground suggest that the picture is much more complicated and different. So while the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, it has been indeed a brutal organization, a very violent extremist group that has been accused of ethnic cleansing and torture and killing. Other Iraqi parties are almost as bad as ISIS. So the Iraqi government itself has been accused of gross human rights violations by very reputable sources such as Human Rights Watch and other international organizations. They have accused the Iraqi authorities of committing war crimes with indiscriminate attacks against civilians and torture and other very serious violations. Shiite militias, including Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi and other militias backed by the Iraqi government, such as Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, they have been also accused of massive violations of human rights. Even the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, the ethnic militias in the north of Iraq, have been also accused of violations of human rights, including ethnic cleansing. So the way that the US is portraying this as us stepping in to take out a bad guy is not accurate. This is an extremely messy ethnic conflict. There are human rights violations on all sides, and the US is actually obligated by international law and US law to stop funding, training, and arming some of its allies, including the Iraqi government, who have been committing these gross human rights violations. So it's not as simple as us just stepping in to help the good guys against the bad guy. And more importantly, inside Iraq, these attacks against ISIS might be viewed as taking the sides of Shiites and Kurds against Sunnis. That's not something that the US should be sending the messages around inside Iraq. My second point about the contradiction between the policies between Iraq and Syria is that while the Obama administration maintains a very convincing line in why they are supporting the Iraqi authorities and the Kurdish forces against the armed opposition groups in the Sunni areas, they have another line of justification to send weapons to the armed opposition groups against the central government in Syria. So in Iraq, they say we have to support the central government. That will give us a little bit more of leverage over the government and will reduce the violations by the government. In Syria, they're saying, we have to support the moderate opposition groups and try to eliminate the more extreme ones, such as ISIS. Now, the surprising point is that the U.S. is actually funding opposite sides of the same conflict because the Syrian opposition groups are directly linked to the Iraqi armed opposition groups, and the Iraqi government is directly linked to the Syrian government. Bashar al-Assad and the Iraqi central government are very strong allies, and Syrian opposition groups in Syria and Iraqi armed opposition groups in the Sunni areas in Iraq are extremely strong allies. So the fact that we're giving $500 million to this side in Iraq and another $500 million to the opposite side in Syria is a sign of lack of a comprehensive vision for the region, that the US is still engaging in these tactics, dealing with one state at a time, and bombing first before thinking about the consequences. Let me end my 5 minutes by saying AFSC opposes the US military intervention in Iraq and Syria, not only because it's illegal and immoral after all of these decades of intervention, but because it doesn't work. We're talking about a group of extremists called ISIS now. It used to be called ISI, the Islamic State in Iraq. The US fought against that group for a long time when we had more than 100,000 troops on the ground. What would make us think that now we can eliminate extremism through dropping more bombs? What can lead us to believe that we can bomb Iraq into moderation and eliminate extremism by more military action if such strategies have failed miserably in the past? Let me stop here, and I hope I will address some of your questions in the question and answer period.
Super. Thank you, Rod. And I want to remind people you can send your questions to questions@afsc.org, and you can also embed them in the chat that should appear below this broadcast on our webpage. Second, I want to welcome Jo Comerford. I forgot to mention that she is also a former AFSC colleague, so I'm thrilled to have her join us.
Thanks, Peter. And it's good to be with you and Riot and Stephen in this important conversation. So as Peter said, you know, my job today is to talk to us about change, the nature of change, and this moment in particular. And Move On members, like all in today's Hangout, have a deep history of both concern and action around hasty, ill-defined military intervention. Last September, we will remember that Move On members joined a broad and loud call to prevent the U.S. military intervention in Syria. We mobilized with AFSC, with Win Without War, and we won. Like now, there were agonizing humanitarian crises reported. It was a highly emotional moment, highly charged, and yet the American people didn't feel that military intervention was the way forward. Move On members were also among the leading voices, together with many allies, galvanizing the powerful anti-war voice opposing the U.S. war in Iraq before it started, and calling for an end to the U.S. war in Iraq and Afghanistan once they began. We have to remember that we were successful in both educating a wide and diverse public and shifting congressional and public sentiment. It's important to remember that now especially. We're mindful of that legacy, and I imagine, like everyone on this call, mindful of our responsibility today. Our members are also keenly aware of our history in the Middle East and passionate about supporting diplomacy and international development. And our members elected President Obama in part because he promised to end the U.S. war in Iraq. So they're very troubled about the threat of waging a new multi-year war against a group of militant fighters in Iraq and Syria. We continue to believe that our nation cannot listen to the same neoconservative forces that cheerleaded our rush into wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan in the first place, like those of John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who have been particularly adamant. We want more attention paid to sound and clear alternatives to military intervention. We've heard it again and again from officials on both sides of the aisle that there is no military-only solution to ISIS, and yet all we hear about in the United States is the military solution. What about stemming the flow of arms? What about real multilateral diplomacy? What about the involvement of the UN? What about significant investment in humanitarian relief for those internally displaced people who have been really bearing the heaviest weight of these multi-year conflicts? We're witnessing right now an escalation of military force even as we speak, from sending arms to directly carrying out US airstrikes to helping retake the Mosul Dam, and now calls for the US to wage a multi-year war to defeat and destroy ISIS. Like all Americans, Move On members are deeply concerned about what they're hearing and reading, and concerned about the full range of consequences. So we want a fact-based, open, robust, public debate about ISIS, about the region, and about the US role, both past and present. Is the fate of the US, this is what we should be asking, right? Is the fate of the US to normalize our heavy military presence in the Middle East? Is that what we want? Is our military might the only option to solve conflict, the only tool we have? And what about the cost? What about the human cost and the economic cost and the moral cost of our next steps as a nation? Move On wants our elected officials to be held accountable for their opinions about the current call for this 3+ year military intervention. We have to remember, friends, that our elected officials, they're in Congress to do our business, right? They do the people's business. So they must be held accountable to raise this debate in a way that everyone can participate, every one of their constituents can participate. So we're going to support our members with our allies, with the great allied coalition that we're in getting answers to tough questions that have yet been answered for the American people, that need to be raised courageously and answered in an honest and open and accessible debate. And by accessible, I mean for people to be able to weigh in and make their voices heard. And we're going to continue to work, again, with allies to aggregate and elevate voices and actions of people of conscience in this critical moment for our nation and our world. You know, I was thinking about today's Google Hangout, Peter, and I thought if history's taught us anything about the nature of change, it's taught us that people are powerful. Individually, we're powerful, friends, and so much more so collectively, which is why members of Move On and members of AFSC and members of Win Without War come together, right? We aggregate ourselves. And we also know that the impossible is just going to take a little while. And it's hard sometimes to deal with that, especially when we know that we're in a rush as a nation, a rush, it seems, to engage again in military ways, or continue to engage again and escalate military intervention. But we have to stay with this trajectory again and believe that our voices and our willingness and ability to wrestle with hard questions and demand a complex and nuanced answer and a nuanced solution is going to make all the difference. So we're calling for widespread and bold impatience. Impatience for questions, impatience for fact-based answers, and impatience for an open and informed debate. And ultimately, impatience for accountability, our nation's accountability for what our next steps are going to be. And I also, like Ryan, look forward to questions and comments and discussion. Thanks, Peter.
Super. Fabulous. Thank you, Joe. Again, you can submit your questions in the stream that's below the broadcast, and also you could email them to questions@afsc.org. And it feels like we've set the table for you, Stephen. Our final speaker is Stephen Miles, who we're going to give him the unenviable task of explaining Washington to us. But let me remind ourselves that Rod's really pointed out what we know about the conflict and how complex it is. And Joe has really said what we want and has articulated sort of the vision of how can we engage and prevent a repetition of what we've seen so many times in recent history. So Stephen, can you wrap those two visions into something that makes sense about what's possible in Washington, D.C.?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and I'll try to do my best to explain Washington beyond just saying it's broken. But it's always nice to be in a chat with folks from Move On from AFSC. Both groups are doing tremendous work, and it's an unenviable task to follow two great speakers. But I'll do my best to talk a little bit about what's going on here in Washington, D.C. today, and to set the precursor for that conversation. We need to talk a little bit about what's actually happening in Iraq, what's happening in Syria that the U.S. is doing, because that sets up the conversation we're having about what the U.S. is now considering doing. So beginning earlier this summer, when we saw the ISIS advance and the fall of Mosul to ISIS and kind of forces aligned with them, we began to see a robust debate in the United States and the U.S. kick into military action. Through a series of deployments over the course of the summer, the U.S. has now sent more than 1,000 troops back into Iraq. Most of them are engaged in protecting the embassy and the Baghdad International Airport, but several hundred are known to be their military advisors, and there's an unknown number of special forces in the country that are operating, presumably under covert authority. In addition to that, later in the summer, in the beginning of August, we began to see the U.S. take direct military action as part of the conflict. Since the first bombs fell outside of Erbil, the first American bombs, we've seen the U.S. do over 100 airstrikes. Primarily, these airstrikes have been around two areas, the Mosul Dam and more recently the Haditha Dam, which is in Anbar province. These airstrikes, when they first happened, there was a tremendous amount of fanfare. There was a lot of conversation about a group of folks named the Yazidis, a religious and ethnic minority who were trapped on Mount Sinjar, a mountainous region in northern Iraq. It's worth noting that very few, a handful at most of these airstrikes were involved in either that mission or another mission that was taken in an area where there were some Iraqis of Turkmen descent who were trapped. The vast majority of these airstrikes have been in conjunction with either Kurdish Peshmerga or Iraqi military forces in their direct military engagements with ISIS and ISIS forces and forces that are allied with ISIS. So that's the backdrop of what's happening so far. We're now having a debate in Congress and in Washington about taking steps further and beyond those airstrikes. We have very conservative, very hawkish voices really leading the charge, saying that the president needs to do more, that we should be having more direct military confrontation, that this problem all exists because the U.S. pulled troops out of Iraq, that we should be sending significant troops back in, and that we should be bombing not only in Iraq but also in Syria. Obviously, and I think we'll get into this more in the question and answer, and my other speakers already spoke to this, but those are obviously all horrible ideas. We can talk a little bit about that more, but that's part of a debate that's happening here in Washington. To answer those calls, the president has announced over the weekend, as Peter mentioned earlier, that he'll be laying out in a national address on Wednesday evening his plan to take on ISIS militants. And while we don't know the details of that speech, we have a good general outline of what it's going to entail. It's going to entail more direct military confrontation, but also, as Raid discussed, the arming and the support of, in Syria, quote-unquote moderate faction of the Syrian opposition, and in Iraq, the Iraqi army and the Iraqi government, as well as the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. In addition to this, we're likely to see a renewed diplomatic push that we hope to see. That's part of what's necessary. But one thing we're not likely to see is any suggestion that Congress need to vote on authorizing military force in Iraq or potentially in Syria. So there's a lively debate going on in Congress now about that question. What we're seeing is that Congress has been out of town for a month. They haven't been here in Washington. They've been out around the country campaigning, taking their traditional summer break. And there's a lot of concern and question about them coming back into Washington. They're all getting into town today. And there's uncertainty about where they are. We've seen a tremendous number of voices come out with very hawkish positions, saying we need to be bombing more, we need to be doing more. We've seen far fewer members of Congress calling for restraint, calling for pursuing the type of diplomatic and political solutions that everyone says are necessary, but are much more complicated and take much longer than simply bombing would do. And so we're not seeing those voices speak up right now. Part of that is what I want to get to as I kind of talk forward, is that we now have an opportunity to change that. You know, Congress is coming back into session. They're coming back from being scattered all around the country. They're coming back and they're waiting to hear and figure out, where are my constituents? You know, it's worth noting that we're now less than 2 months away from an election, and Congress, which is a place that's always focused on politics, is even more so focused on politics right now. So they are hypersensitive to the political concerns of their constituents. To date, what they've done is they've seen the horrific images that we've all seen broadcast on CNN and elsewhere, and they've felt the need to react and say, in this kind of traditional notion we see in American politics, that, you know, we have to be strong, and that the only way you can be strong is bombing. And so we've seen these voices come out. What again we've not seen is, we've not seen calmer heads prevail. We've not seen the types of voices that have been right about these questions over time leading the charge, and we haven't really yet seen a robust push from the American public to make them do that. That's where we come in. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why we're talking about what are the solutions today and how you can have your voice heard. In the next 2 weeks, Congress is going to be in Washington, and there's a very real potential that they will potentially vote on a war authorization for ISIS, so a war authorization in Iraq or Syria, or some other congressional action related to the conflict. Left to their own devices in the environment as we see it now, we would expect that outcome to be very bad. We need to have the American public have their voice heard in this debate. We need to have people take a step back, acknowledge the reality that you've heard all the speakers acknowledge, and I'll acknowledge it today. There are truly atrocious things being done in Iraq and Syria, some of them by ISIS, some of them by other parties in the conflict. We have seen an unbelievable loss of life over the last 3 years. We should use the outrage that we see because of that violence, the outrage we feel when we see American journalists beheaded, the horror we see when we see hundreds of thousands of civilians killed over many years in a conflict. We should direct our emotions on that into demanding that our representatives in Congress use the next several weeks, and indeed the next several months, to actually seek solutions in the Middle East that will stem this conflict, that will make the violence decrease, not make the violence increase, and not make the problems worse. So I'm going to end my portion by making a strong plea that after we have a chance to have some good question and debate here, that folks really take the time to make their voices heard on this, that they work with organizations like AFSC, Move On, and other organizations that they may be a member of to have their voice heard in this debate in Congress, because we're going to have a lively debate in Congress, and if we don't stand up and put forward a strong voice for peace, no one else will.
Great, thank you, Stephen, and thank all of you for packing in so much information in a short period of time. I want to start with one of the questions that we've received, and I think it's the right place to start. The question is, I've heard anti-war groups advocate multinational diplomacy so many times that I wind up wondering whether Obama has given this a try and found no takers. The truly powerful neighboring nations, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and India, have extremely disparate interests. How can they all work together with the United States? So he or she has some details in there, but the foundation of that question is, if we're always pushing for diplomacy and shared interests, why is it so hard to get done? And I'll let Raed start.
I mean, I can just start with a small comment about that. The notion that a solution for Iraq will come through a regional agreement only, without having an Iraqi solution come first, is a misguided notion. Because, as the question states, there are different interests. You know, Iran's interest in Iraq is not necessarily in Iraq's best interest. Turkey's interest in Iraq is not necessarily in Iraq's best interest. So having a regional buy-in is different than having a regional proposal for a solution. And I think that has been the problem, is that we need an Iraqi solution, a solution to come from Iraq, designed by Iraqis for Iraqis, and then regional and international powers can endorse and help that happen. That solution has not happened yet, and the conditions for that solution to happen have not really occurred on the ground yet, because Iraq is still divided. The current political system is dysfunctional, and it's extremely unlikely that it will manage to get a national consensus for a plan. That said, we should wait for a few days because the Iraqi government should announce its formation for the new Iraqi government. So there might be some encouraging news on that front. But in short, I think we cannot move forward without an Iraqi solution first.
Yeah, this is Steve. I'd like to just add something to that. I think Raid is exactly right. The solution to these problems is going to only be solved ultimately by Iraqis and by Syrians. You know, they're the ones who have to live with the choices that we are pretending to make for them in our other capitals. And so they have to find solutions that ultimately allow them to live in peace, allow them to feel secure, and that they will feel bought into. But I do want to add a word about why so many of us feel that regional diplomacy is so important, and that's because to a great extent regional parties are fueling this conflict. You know, this is a conflict that at this point is stretching in some ways from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, and you have parties on all sides who are adding tremendous amounts of arms, tremendous amounts of money, tremendous amounts of fighters to this conflict. And if the regional parties want to continue to see violence in these countries, they can continue to fight the types of proxy wars that we've seen fought throughout too much of the 20th century. And unless and until we can convince those parties that they shouldn't be fighting a proxy war, that they're doing more harm than good, we're not going to have a solution to this problem. The last thing I'll say is that there's some particular roles that countries like Turkey and others can play that they're not playing right now, which is cutting off access to the arms supply routes that are funneling arms into the countries. Other countries are directly supplying money and arms. They need to be forced to stop doing that as well. And the final aspect, you know, we've often talked so often in this conflict and in this region about oil, but one of the ways that ISIS is able to gain so much of its money is that they're selling oil that they control in Iraq and Syria on the black market. There should be immediately an effort put to stop Turkish and other buyers of this oil from being able to put millions and millions of dollars in the hands of these groups. You know, cutting off the supply of funds to ISIS by cutting off their access for oil on the black market would do more damage to that group than any U.S. bomb could ever do. So we need to have an honest assessment, but as Raid said, and I totally agree, at the end of the day, the ultimate solution is going to depend on finding one that the Iraqis and the Syrians can live with.
And I'll just hop in and say that I totally concur with Riot and Stephen, and also just want to push back a little bit on the fact that we've actually managed to fund adequately diplomacy and or other kinds of humanitarian intervention over time. We don't. As we know, the U.S. federal budget absolutely privileges military intervention over other kinds of intervention, and therefore we've really not, I think, as a nation, given other ways forward the due they deserve, right? So the kinds of intervention that Stephen's talking about really require multilateral diplomacy, which is requires investment on the part of our nation, both in terms of strategy but also in terms of funding, because all of the tools that would be needed, whether it's economic sanctions or humanitarian aid or really working UN channels with allies, international allies, that requires an infrastructure in this country that we simply don't have enough of. And so whatever we're talking about today, you know, could lead us to some larger systemic, much farther reaching ways forward for our nation, because we always return as the United States to this point. We only have these tools, and therefore every problem looks like it needs military intervention.
Super. I want to remind people you can send us your questions at afsc.org, and of course you can put them in the stream below the broadcast as well. One of the questions I have as they continue to come in is the United Nations has been deeply connected and involved with the U.S. and this long history in Iraq since 1991. Particularly, we hear most about the humanitarian part of the United Nations work. WHO, UNICEF, these agencies that are trying to address elements of the humanitarian crisis. I'd like to ask, what are some of the initiatives that are happening within the political apparatus of the United Nations? Within the Security Council, is there a sense that this is a mission that they want to endorse, or is there a sense that the United States needs to be urged to engage with diplomacy versus bringing a request for the use of force to the United Nations Security Council? And maybe, let's start with you, Stephen.
Sure. So we have not yet seen a full-scale involvement of the United Nations Security Council in this crisis. The Security Council has made a couple statements and a couple denunciations of the violence, and as you mentioned, the non-political, the humanitarian arms of the UN have been very involved. They're on the ground supplying humanitarian resource, which we should acknowledge the U.S. is significantly contributing financial resources to. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but the U.S. is indeed the leading contributor to that humanitarian effort. We need to see more done with this political process, though. It's worth noting that the United States is about to, if they haven't already done so, take over the presidency of the Security Council for the next several weeks. We will be in a unique role, given that, to set the agenda of the Security Council. Now, there's some hope and there's some talk that the U.S. may be preparing to take action at the Security Council to bring the issue before the Security Council, but we haven't yet really seen that initiative, and we certainly haven't had it announced. That may change on Wednesday, and that would be one of the things to look for as people watch the president's speech on Wednesday. But there's really an opportunity to say, this is a problem that is a problem in this regional crisis. We need to get the world involved, and we have mechanisms to do that, and we need to utilize those.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay, another question. We have a number of questions coming in, and one very specifically from Bob, and that is a question about the origin and lineage of ISIS, the players, alignments in what countries or regions. He goes on to say, without a doubt, any military action should be carefully considered with cultural and long-term considerations. However, should delaying action increase the long-term economic human cost in the long run, not even including humanitarian disaster in the meantime? So the question, what you initially started to address, Riot, is what is the appropriate response when we see a humanitarian crisis unfolding before us? But of course, this is a question for some more detail on ISIS.
I can say a couple of words about the origins of ISIS. ISIS started in Iraq after the US invasion. Iraq never had any extremist or terrorist groups exist before the US invasion and before the destruction of the central government in 2003. So we should always remember this, that the mere presence of these extremist groups has become possible because of the US military intervention and because of the destruction of legitimate national players who used to be able to protect their nation's borders. Now, ISIS can be traced back to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq existed or started to show up there in 2003, 2004. And after that, it changed its title and name to the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI. The Islamic State in Iraq was criticized very heavily, even by Al-Qaeda at that time, because on the one hand, it was very brutal. On the other hand, Iraqi Sunnis saw it as a separatist Sunni group, because it wanted to establish a state in the Sunni provinces in Iraq. And the majority of Iraqi Sunnis and the majority of Iraqi Shiites prefer to live in one united country, not in sectarian enclaves. So there was some resistance to the concept of separation. The Islamic State in Iraq was extremely brutal in the years that it rose, in 2006 and 2007. The US military tried to fight it during that time when we had more than 100,000 troops in the country. And now we see that the group still exists. So I think that the mere fact that ISIS still exists is an indication that fighting them through military force and dropping more bombs is not really a good strategy. The second point that I want to make is that there seems to be some manipulation of ISIS and other terrorist groups by regional powers or international powers. For example, some of the regional and local governments have been allowing some of these groups to flourish on the expense of other groups. So they interfere to weaken some of the groups, allow some of the groups to get more funding or sell oil. And there's this manipulation by some of the regional powers is, of course, creating more and more violence in the region and in Iraq. So that's another point that should be taken in consideration, that regional powers so far were mostly negative when it comes to the situation in Iraq, because in many cases their interests have not aligned with Iraq's national interest. So it was in their interest to support directly or indirectly some of these extremist groups and let them do whatever they want to do to support their own agendas.
All right. Thank you, Rod. We have. I'm going to group together a couple questions that's coming through the chat that I think are related, and would be interested in hearing what you all have to say. The first one is, what can we do as an international community to address the root causes of conflict to stop emerging groups such as ISIS? Interesting, because there certainly is historical precedent for that type of thing. And then I think somewhat related, and let's address them at the same time, when advocating for diplomacy, how much emphasis is given to making sure women are at the peace negotiations and part of the solution? I think they both get to what societies want and what societies need and what security looks like. So who wants to start with that question? All right, why don't we go with Stephen first?
Sure. So the first part of the question, I'm going to take the second part first. The short answer is not nearly enough has been done to include women in the peacemaking process. The role of women in peace building is actually fairly well studied in the academic literature and just kind of in practice and example of conflicts around the world. It's an immense role, and the short answer is when you do not involve women in that process, you do not get outcomes that are nearly as good. One of the problems that we've had over the last several years is that we've created these political processes in these countries to try to deal with these problems, and too often we've left women out of the conversation. And that has to happen in a myriad of ways, and Secretary Clinton, to her credit, had a lot of good efforts in this regard. But unfortunately, one of the things we saw was that those efforts are almost always undermined, because to a point Joe was making earlier, we always reach when things hit the fan, as it were, we reach for our hammer because it's so much better funded, it's so much better supplied and resourced than everything else. And so, for instance, when you see things like the work that's happened in Afghanistan, and you see the kind of commentary that everyone knows about kind of needing to create economic development, needing to create opportunities for young men to find ways of making a living that don't involve joining a local militia, that they have another source of income, that they can find hope and optimism elsewhere, rather than using the type of mechanisms and resources that we know that have worked throughout history. Because we have troops in theater, because we have combat troops on the ground, we run all of that through the military. And then when that aid is militarized, when we aren't utilizing local cultures, when we aren't utilizing tribal structures and other existing community structures that know the lay of the land, we're just relying on kind of what a general thinks is going to be the most important. We end up doing things like we've done in Afghanistan, where maybe we build some highways that come in very handy, or we've built quite famously massive bases that no troop will ever use, but we don't do much to create the systems on the ground for peace. we need to incorporate some of those lessons we've learned over the last 13 years, what hasn't worked, but also what has worked, and apply that to peace building, not only in this conflict, but around the world. And I'm gonna end there because I know my colleagues have some other thoughts on this area.
Okay, let's start with Joe, and then let's address the root cause question after.
Sure. And I wanted to jump in on a point that Stephen made about the fact that when the U.S. gives aid, especially in situations like this, it is often militarized, which I think is really, really important because the Pentagon itself has said in the past, hey, we may not be the right people to do conflict prevention, conflict resolution, infrastructure building, education building. So it's even had its own critique of its toolbox, if you will, and the best uses of it. And yet we continue as a nation to put the military into places where it is in fact the purveyor of these kinds of solutions. And we again have to wonder, well, if it's not working, why is it not working? And that's one of the reasons, besides being, I think, wholly underfunded, is that we continue to militarize these forms of aid and/or these forms of approaches and undercut their whole sense and the kind of transformation that could be gotten should the approach be different. And I will also say that in addition to the point about women being at tables of conflict prevention and resolution, there have been now many, many studies by Karuna Center for Peacebuilding and others that have really actually, as Stephen said, championed the role of women as conflict preventers. And so there's, I think the question is a good one. And I also appreciate Secretary Clinton's work to put women in the front lines, if you will, of these kinds of issues.
Okay, thank you, Stephen and Joe. And I think you were kind of touching on sort of the impact of militarized aid and even this notion that foreign policy and diplomacy has become so militarized in a post 9/11 world. We have a number of questions coming in through the stream that, again, are asking for us to talk some about the root causes. And I'll start with what in some ways is the most obvious. And we've seen groups emerge in countries in other parts of the Middle East that gain support and gain power when the services needed or required from a government are not given. And so sometimes I think we have a simplistic view of the origins of some of the organizations that we simply label as terrorist or as opposition. And very often we see kernels of activism and kernels of organizing that's really designed and set around providing the needs of communities that are not being met by various different governments. So I'm wondering if each of you wanted a moment to kind of address what are ways to talk about and address the root causes of what we see in a very ugly way, an extremely ugly way in ISIS, but I think is manifested in many, many different types of ways in other places in the world.
So I'll jump in there and offer a kind of brief comment first, and then I think my colleagues are going to want to chime in. And I'll start with we don't always know exactly what the root causes are and what the solutions are, but we do know what exacerbates them. We know what makes it worse. And sometimes we need to take a step back and go with the old adage, first do no harm. It's time and time again in these regions and in these areas that have these challenges, we see a notion put forward that we can jump in and not really get in the middle of kind of what these root causes are, but just take limited, precise military action to address counterterrorism threats to America. So kind of most famously over the last several years have seen this in Yemen, Somalia, and in Pakistan. And what you see in these regions is you see that the limited use of military force by the U.S., even if it's only a drone strike every week or a month or so, I mean, that's a lot, that's a very frequent occurrence. It sounds very infrequent to us because we're comparing it against the type of operational tempo of the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. But if you were living where I am in Northeast DC and once a month a bomb fell out of the sky, it would kind of be big news, and it would change dramatically what happened on the ground and in the area. And so it's not surprising. We have a decade of evidence of what happens when you do this. It leads to more extremism. It leads to more militants being created than we ever kill, and it leads to making the problems fundamentally worse. That's not to say that the U.S. simply has to sit on its hands and do nothing, but we do need to recognize when we're making a problem worse. And when you look at a place like Waziristan in Pakistan, or in Yemen, or in Somalia, and you see this type of limited military force, this quote-unquote targeted precision strikes, you see it creating more extremists. You see it leading to political instability. You have to take a step back and say, clearly this isn't the solution. And then I'm going to let my colleagues talk about some of the things that hopefully are the solution.
Well, why don't you get us started, Ryan?
I mean, first I want to reiterate a point that has been made earlier about the United States intervention being a part of the problem and being one of these root causes for destruction and chaos in Iraq and even now in Syria, particularly in Iraq. And I think that's important because the United States is not a bystander who's just like willing to step in now to fix the situation. There has been a history of involvement in Iraq, and many of the problems that we're facing today in the country, including the destruction of the Iraqi Central Army, the collapse of the national identity in Iraq, and the ethnic and sectarian cleansing campaigns that have destroyed the demographic overlap of the country. All of these things happened either directly by the United States or under the US watch during the years of the occupation. So while the US has a moral and legal obligation to fix what has been broken in Iraq, I don't think that dropping more bombs on the country is the way to fulfill these obligations. So, you know, you're asking for answers, and I think there are many answers out there. There are very smart solutions that have been proposed in the last few years by regional actors, by Iraqis, and even by international players in the US and abroad. They include reforming the Iraqi government in a way that is less sectarian or even non-sectarian, trying to include populations that have been pushed out of the political system. Other ideas to re-engage some of the regional powers around Iraq to have some sort of a shared security umbrella that they can work within, you know, having grant bargains with Iran and other major powers in the region. So, I mean, I can go in details into these proposals, but the thing about it is we can't work on long-term strategies and meetings and reconciliation while the US is bombing Iraq and Syria. These things cannot happen at the same time. We can't be dropping bombs directly and indirectly on Mosul and Ramadi and Fallujah and Kirkuk. There are massacres happening on a daily basis, and at the same time speak about a national unity government. These things can't happen. So I think the first step towards having these great, very, you know, visionary ideas about fixing Iraq is actually doing no more harm. And doing no more harm has to include the US to stop immediate attacks, and the US to stop arming different factions in Iraq, whether these factions were sectarian and ethnic militias, or whether they were the Iraqi government itself, without having a better system of tracking human rights abuses and having that as a part of a larger comprehensive strategy.
And I would just jump in and say that, as Stephen said, we've had a long time now as a nation to look at the impact of military intervention as opposed to robust, say, humanitarian intervention. And there have been, I'm sure, as my colleagues know and listeners know, more studies than we can count by the UN agencies, NGOs, international and domestic NGOs, about the kinds of benefits we get when we invest in infrastructure, in clean water, in enough food, in education, both here in the United States, I might add, and internationally. And we just know this. We know it to be true that when the hierarchy of need in a region is satisfied, if people feel safe, Raed was talking about common security. If there is a notion of common security, then we actually know that it can both de-escalate current conflict and it can prevent conflict. And so again, I think root causes of poverty, of violence against women, of a lack of education, of chronic lack of being able to be recognized by the international community as agents of their own destiny. These are root causes of systemic conflict that just endures, and that's something we as a nation, I think, can be very powerful as Americans in calling for us to really examine our actions and really look at the ways in which we don't invest in the kind of roots and root advances that could actually make an enormous difference, both in Iraq and Syria, but of course around the globe.
Super. Thank you all. We're getting close to time. We have about 4 minutes left, and we wanted to touch on a question that's come in different forms through chat and online is around the question of genocide and U.S. intervention. And so let's have some quick remarks, Raed, then Stephen, and Joe, and then we'll be about to wrap up.
I was very concerned that the president used the G word, genocide, to describe the situation regarding the Yazidis, because that's a very, very serious allegation. A week after the president used the word genocide, the Pentagon put an official assessment based on 20 advisors who landed on Mount Sinjar. And they said, there isn't really a humanitarian crisis here. They have access to water and food, and they don't need our help in evacuation. So there are so many shades of gray between no humanitarian crisis and genocide. And I think it's dangerous to use these words as buzzwords to justify military intervention, because there are real acts of genocide happening around the world that then we will take lightly. So I think there are better mechanisms in investigating claims of genocide than just throwing it around at a political speech or relying on media coverage. The second point that is even more important, responding to acts of genocide is not something that we have to invent on the spot. It's not that we have to go bomb a nation to stop genocide now, because there are very elaborate conventions and mechanisms internationally in dealing with these issues. And the US doesn't have to and should not interfere in Iraq unilaterally under the excuse of dealing with genocide. We have to push it through the United Nations and other appropriate international channels.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things to that. I mean, I think we need to always be careful when we are presented with the false choice between bombing and doing nothing. I mean, I think progressives, liberals, kind of whatever folks want to call themselves these days, rightfully get very animated when we hear things like genocide, when we hear of mass atrocities, when we see the type of images either we saw last summer coming out of Syria with chemical weapons, or we saw this summer with the Yazidis trapped on Mount Sinjar and elsewhere, and we're kind of told we have to respond to this. And again, the only response that's offered up is the military solution, is bombing. We need look back no further than what happened last year in Syria in which the response originally was going to be this limited bombing campaign, quote unquote, that was not really going to solve the problem, but was going to punish Assad for his use of chemical weapons. Instead, diplomatically, we found a solution that actually completely, as of now, has eliminated Assad's chemical weapon stockpiles. This was one of the last chemical weapon stockpiles in the world, and diplomacy was able to completely eliminate it. Similarly, we saw in Iraq, we saw not just the U.S. airdrops that supplied food and water to the Yazidis. And this is an area that the U.S. should be proud of what we did. You know, there was efforts by the Iraqi Air Force previously to do this. They lack some of the capability that we do, and so lots of their water broke, the water bottles spilled, for instance. You know, this is one area where we have capacity that we should use. And when people are dying of hunger and thirst, providing them with food and water is usually a better way to save them than dropping bombs somewhere nearby. And ultimately, we need to be finding those creative solutions. We need to be demanding that our policymakers find and take actions that are, again, actually going to solve the problems, not just throwing a bomb at them.
Super, thank you. We're right at 4 o'clock, and we promised people this would be an engaged and insightful hour. I want to give you a chance, some final comments. For those of you who have sent in questions that we didn't get to, we will respond, and we'll send you an answer. Some of them are issues around initiatives in Congress and outreach strategies that actually the 4 of us are going to be talking about tomorrow and in the coming weeks organizationally. So we will make sure and update all of you on the most up-to-date thinking. That said, any final comments you want to leave with people, Stephen or Joe?
Sure, I'll jump in and just say that for me, Raed's comment about the kinds of reporting that we were hearing around Mount Sinjar and what actually was happening, if we looked deeper, was for me really emblematic of the kind of lack of widespread credible information coming out and the lack of our ability to access it and as American people, and then have that help inform how we speak with our elected officials. So I've heard that before from Raed, and for me, that's one of the nuggets that I take with me is we have to look deeper, not just the headlines, but deeper into the stories about what people are saying, both military officials in the United States and Iraqis and our allies in the region. So I want us to be voracious for credible, comprehensive, complex information that I think we're going to need if we as the American people want to pressure lawmakers for an informed and accountable debate, and if for us as a nation to find a way forward that isn't a re-upping of military intervention in an endless war context.
So I'll go next. I just want to really thank everyone for taking an hour out of their day. You know, this is an immensely complex issue. This is a conflict that has multiple players, multiple actors acting for different reasons. It changes almost by the hour, if not by the minute, and so it's very, very important that folks take the time to get involved, educate themselves, and ultimately what I hope people will do from here is take action. However you feel about this issue, you should be having your voice heard in Congress, because Congress is going to be debating on this, the President's going to be taking actions about this, and they're going to take those actions in our name. And we need to stand up and let it be known how we want them to act. A year ago, it was a done deal in the conventional wisdom in Washington that we were going to bomb Syria. The American people spoke up, we didn't bomb Syria, we undid a done deal. The people can speak up again, they can change conventional wisdom, they can have tremendous impact, but only if people begin to organize, begin to get active, and make their voices heard in Washington.
I just want to end by reiterating the point about dealing with information that comes from areas of conflict. We should ask questions. Why are we getting information about a hungry or thirsty child in Iraq, not about a hungry or thirsty child somewhere else in the world, somewhere else in Africa that we're not stepping in to help, or in the Middle East or in Asia? There are very political agendas that sometimes uses these humanitarian crises. And I think especially for our constituents, AFSC and Move On and Win Without War, we don't have to convince you guys that we should not go to war with Iraq to steal their oil. I think we're all in agreement on that. But then the hard question is, how do we deal with allegations of a monstrous extremist group that is about to kill thirsty children on top of a mountain? Now that's the hard question. Are we going to buy the arguments of unilateral military intervention to save the babies? Because that is our hardest question. And I think it's larger than our discussion now to solve it, but it's something to think about in the future. How do we rely on information? How can we examine information? And how do we see our role in engaging to solve these problems through other means other than bombing other countries?
Great. Well, thank you, Rad. Thank you, Joe and Stephen, for joining us. And y'all have a lot of food for thought. So if you have time to listen to the President's remarks on Wednesday, I hope you'll have some lenses to think critically and keep your ears open for some initiatives coming from these three groups. Thank you very much for your time.